thanks to everyone for coming out, and thank you to the county for putting this this panel and this presentation together. It's always really great for me to see people's interest and institutions' interest in community benefits approaches, since it's what I've been working on for so long, and see familiar faces in the room. So look forward to talking with you all a little more after in the breakout sessions. So as May mentioned, what I'm trying to do is provide a very sort of large-scale overview of the community, what the main concepts behind the community benefits movement are, and what these tools are, and sort of the range of mechanisms that the public has to try to deliver and improve the community benefits results for residents. And so a few definitional terms, and then some examples of community benefits agreements and other tools that go along this way, and talk with you a little about some of the legal issues that come up in some of the approaches I've seen in my time working in this. I actually got my start working in this area in San Mateo County, in East Palo Alto. When I came out of law school, I was on a fellowship to work on local hiring and local business policies for the redevelopment efforts in East Palo Alto, which was in the mid-90s. I don't know how many of you remember, but there was nothing there off the freeway. The Gateway 101 project, as they called it, wasn't yet in place. And that was sort of a classic situation where you had a low-income community, had some desirable land, you needed a stronger tax base. But what was unusual about East Palo Alto is it wasn't a low-income community in a much bigger city where they were sort of fighting to have influence within the government. The whole city was low-income. So the advocates for the low-income community really hadn't enough influence to help set terms for the city when it was negotiating with developers to start those projects going. And the number one thing that the city was interested in was local jobs. Local hiring. There was simply no political support for starting a big development project in East Palo Alto at that time without strong local hiring and efforts to get local residents into the jobs in that project. So we did a lot of work on that and ended up with a very thorough local hiring policy that's been expanded on over the years and is still in place on the Four Seasons down there and IKEA and different big entities that have come in over time, as well as all the smaller stores in those malls. So that was sort of my start with this. So it's a little connection to San Mateo County, and also just I thought I should flesh that out a little for you because it was kind of a good example of that. It's local. Anyway, can we just go? I'd like to just get a little better understanding of the audience. Can I just get a general idea? So can you just raise your hand if you work for a public entity, any kind of government entity? Right, a good chunk. And then how about like a private nonprofit service provider of some kind? And then how about a private nonprofit advocate, like a social justice or community advocate? Okay.
Elected official?
Sorry?
Elected official.
Elected official. Thank you very much. Or public staff or staff. Very good. Thanks. So I've sort of run the, I guess this doesn't count as a spectrum because it's only a small part, but I've gone all the way from it, sometimes representing community-based organizations in their advocacy around community benefits, but also a lot of representation of public entities who are trying to engage in best practices and do a good job with their community benefits approaches. So I do a lot of both of those things, and have ever since I started working in East Palo Alto about 20 years ago. Okay, so let's go to the general topic. I was trying to think of this large-scale concept of community benefits, and the best I can come up with as a definition is when you talk about efforts to promote or deliver community benefits, you're talking about efforts to capture the maximum public benefit out of private economic activity and governmental action, with an emphasis on equity. An emphasis on widely shared benefits and making sure that the parts of the population in a given city or a given region that are having the biggest challenges with housing, with jobs, and so forth are the targets. That's who you're aiming to help with the community benefits approach. I think you can't quite talk about community benefits without equity. And there's an aspect here where community benefits is sort of broad term, it can be very fuzzy. But one of the things that it's sort of like, if you're thinking of a big project, like someone wants to put a stadium in a city and wants the taxpayers to help fund it, at that high level, there are always going to be people who say, look, that the stadium is a community benefit, right? It's going to, it's going to take up space that's just being used as an empty parking lot right now. It's going to employ this many people. It's going to provide this much in terms of taxes. But obviously, that's not the whole picture, right? So, and even with something that's sort of less of an obvious symbol than a stadium, like a mixed-use project, like a 100-point shipyard project in the Bayview, if the project is built, there will be more housing, there will be some jobs, there will be more taxes. But usually when people talk about community benefits, they're not talking about the things that are intrinsic to the project if it gets built, right? They're not talking about just is it a good project or a bad project and calling every aspect of it that's good a community benefit. We're usually talking a little more specifically about the negotiated aspects of a project like that. How much affordable housing is the developer going to be asked to provide? Will there be an explicit local jobs program as part of it? Will there be a living wage requirement, et cetera? So it's not things that are intrinsic to the development or intrinsic to a public activity, but the rather negotiated aspects where you get into these issues like equity and the leverage points for the public and the momentum for the project and all those complicated things. So I just wanted to draw that distinction because it definitely narrows what we're talking about with community benefits. So I mentioned a couple of these examples of policy goals or practices that can be delivered through a community benefits approach that we already talked about. Obviously funding for affordable housing, funding for job training, funding for schools, funding for health, funding for parks. Local hiring, local employment programs are one of the main things that we hear that my clients, whether public or private, are always looking for when it comes to community benefits. Living wage requirements are very commonly seen as well. One of the policy points that is becoming routine in the Bay Area now, although maybe not across the country, is quote-unquote ban the box requirements. Particular efforts to make sure that in the hiring process, ex-offenders are not excluded at the front end in an overbroad way. And you would also put in the category of community benefits open space requirements, pedestrian access, and other aspects of the planning process like pedestrian and transit-friendly design. I think May did a good job in the introduction of explaining how many of those things tie directly to health of the community as well as being benefits in themselves. Any questions sort of about the general concept of community benefits? Is what I'm going to do now is dive into sort of the range of tools, or the categories of tools that are used to advance these, or that I see most often. All right, so some of these tools, when I was trying to think of the ways to sort of talk with you about this, the big categories I see are whether you're talking about what kind of community benefits are going to be delivered by a particular project or initiative of the government or a public-private entity, as opposed to broadly applicable policies and rules like zoning, so forth. So there are these community benefits debates and policies sort of play out both in these project-by-project negotiations and essentially a planning and negotiation process around a project, and they play out in the zoning and planning process and with other laws that a city can enact. So the project-by-project basis is where you get the concept of a community benefits agreement. So people have heard the term CBA, community benefits agreement? Raise your hand if you've heard that one. Okay, so that's another term that has been used for a lot of different things over the years. What I like to reserve the term community benefits agreement for is a project-specific, legally enforceable contract setting out the community benefits that that project will deliver if it's constructed. So you usually only see these kind of agreements being negotiated or even advocated for when it's a very large project in an urban area that implicates the needs and desires of a lot of different stakeholders. So a classic example of that would be the Bayview Hunters Point Shipyard redevelopment project in San Francisco, the Oakland Army base redevelopment, basically all these base reuse projects around the Bay Area have some kind of effort like this. And there were a lot down in LA. The most famous one is probably the Staple CPA LA Live is what it's called. That was about 10 years ago now, 10 or 12 years ago. So again, these are contracts that lay out the community benefits that these big projects will provide if they are constructed. So they're negotiated at the time of or before project approval, and they involve, generally the private community benefits agreement involve a range of stakeholder organizations and the developer coming to agreement and saying, we'll support this project if we have legally binding assurances that it will deliver X, Y, and Z community benefits if it's built. So again, none of this makes sense unless you distinguish the negotiated benefits from the project as a whole, right? So community groups are not negotiating over how much sales tax a big project is going to pay, or usually the traditional design elements of a project that you get out of the planning process. They're negotiating over local hire and living wages, things like that, levels of affordable housing. So those have been very prominent, very successful in some cases, certainly captured the attention of foundations and academics and community advocates over the last 10 years, but it is very important to move beyond just talking about CBAs, community benefits agreements, to broader models that will capture a wider range of projects. I want to emphasize before we get to those wider policies though, that even in the absence of a CBA, for these kind of big projects, they're almost always essentially public-private negotiations, right? You don't have a stadium or a giant infill development or a mall that's a quote-unquote by-right project. So a by-right project means, so that's by-right, and what that means is you've got a landowner or a developer owns a parcel of land, and what they want to build is within the existing zoning of the land. That means they're allowed to build it, there's not a negotiation, there's not a back and forth, they just have the right to build it, so they build it. That's a by right project, and it's generally not a vehicle for community benefits discussions when one comes up. But if they are asking for substantial public involvement, such as use of eminent domain to obtain some land, public support for the financing, certainly a subsidy for the project, any kind of public involvement with the land, you do have a negotiation, you have public leverage at that point. So then there's a discussion again about community benefits. That's where you've got long negotiations over what the particulars of the project are going to be, who is going to build it, what's the financial relationship between the public entity and the developer, as well as what the developer is going to provide in terms of local hire, in terms of quality jobs, in terms of affordable housing. And I think there's been a lot of effort, a lot of momentum, I should say, in the last few years for public entities to be sort of more sort of forward-thinking, more sort of having as a clearly stated priority that they're going to capture as much community benefits as possible in these negotiations. And it's very context dependent. It goes to what is the posture of the public entity in negotiating with this private developer. What are the chances the developer is going to walk? How much does the project, how important is the project to the community in the eyes of the decision makers? What is the role of the staff in sort of driving this as opposed to the role of the elected officials that are the ultimate decision makers? So it can play out in all kinds of different ways, but I do think it's fair to say that certainly in the Bay Area, there's been a lot more explicit interest on the part of elected officials and their staff and public entities generally, at least in cities and jurisdictions where they're not just desperate for any economic activity, which now covers most of the Bay Area, to treat these community benefits terms as essential deal points that need to be taken seriously and negotiated out in a legally binding way, the same way all the other deal points are, the same way the other business points are. So local hire, again, is a really good example. So until the past 10 or 15 years, most of the times, local jobs is one of the big policy goals of public entities in improving these projects. They're one of the main things the developers and supporters of the project say the project is going to deliver. They're one of the most important things the public cares about. But there's, until recently, there usually weren't policies actually making sure that jobs in the project would be targeted to the residents near the project. or if they were not sort of in the level of detail that you have for the rest of the contract. They were sort of written out as these aspirational things, maybe a page or a couple paragraphs saying we're going to try to find local residents for these jobs. But as this becomes considered a legitimate and normal policy goal of the public entity in negotiating with the developers, these local hiring policies get fleshed out. They get put in, there's a lot more detail about how it's supposed to work. They become truly legally binding deal points, and they're a lot more successful than when it's essentially sort of a handshake deal that's thrown into a complicated project. All right, so that's a little on the government negotiation, and I do think the politics have changed on that a little bit. So if we move off of sort of the public and private negotiations around particular projects that are being considered, and you step back to the policy level, you see a few different kinds of sort of broadly applicable policies that are focused on delivering community benefits. One of the most obvious is living wage policies that cover contractors receiving public contracts. So that could be just all the many kinds of contractors that jurisdictions have. I think there's 150 or 200 different jurisdictions around the country that have living wage policies. And it just says, if you are going to receive a contract from this public entity, you need to pay all your workers at least $10 an hour or $12 an hour, whatever it is in that policy. There are also local hiring policies applying to public contractors. All kinds of public works contracts have a large slate of public requirements. And depending on the jurisdiction, this can be quite an elaborate range of policies. At one point, about 10 years ago, I was asked to do a spreadsheet of what policies are applicable to contractors for the city of San Francisco. And even as an advocate of these kind of policies, it was kind of startling. There was about 30 plus different policies applicable, from the most obvious ones that are in the newspaper a lot, like living wages and domestic benefits policies, to things that you've probably never heard of, like the tropical hardwood ban and enforcing the McBride principles related to the Northern Ireland conflict, which was new to me and is important to somebody that's in San Francisco law. But the basic concept that if you are the public and you are spending money, and someone is coming and saying they want to perform a job, that you could attach conditions to it that involve policy goals for the public that are not just get the job done in the cheapest, most competent way possible, is very well established at this point. So a lot of community benefits requirements like local hire and living wages and band of box are playing out along with public contracts. So also, as part of public contracting programs, local business opportunity ordinances are another big thing. So in past years, pre-Prop 209, you had MBE and WB ordinances. Those are fairly gutted in California now, although not, there are still some important things that public entities can do. So there's more of an emphasis on small local business policies as a community benefits policy attached to public contracting. As with local hire, this gets a lot more complex with public works construction because of the complexity of the industry, but it is still doable and it is still done. So those kind of policies are generally written for public contracts, but they often contain a clause saying, and they'll apply to any subsidized development project as well. So now you're getting back to the particular development projects that come in that might receive a public subsidy and wanting to apply all those same policies that I just described for public contracting to a nominally private project that's relying on some contribution or support from the public in order to go forward. So you'll see those as well. And then the last sort of big topic I wanted to mention is the whole rubric of the zoning and planning process. So this is where the public is not spending money. The public does not have the leverage of a negotiator who is going to figure out what is the right deal, what are my priorities, how can I get the most of what I want in all these areas without the other party walking. That's the negotiation around a private project. And it's sort of the negotiation underpinning terms attached to public contracting as well, because if you attach too many terms, maybe people won't come bid for your contracts, although I've never found that to occur in reality. But with zoning, you're really in a different political, legal, and policy realm, and that's the realm of regulation, right? That's what you're doing when you're zoning. You're setting rules and laws that are going to govern the private activity of and developers. And in most cases, you're going to be setting, it's obviously an incredibly important function, and you're going to be setting up what the systems are for open space and density and affordable housing and all these different things. So the aspects of the zoning landscape where you see community benefits discussions play out are in, obviously affordable housing is incredibly important, incredibly prominent around the Bay Area right now. All the discussions about inclusionary housing versus fees, when developers are required to make contributions to an affordable housing fund as opposed to when they're required to build some on site, as opposed to when they're required to do nothing. So impact fees on affordable housing are a variety of the sort of more broad concept of impact fees, which are very well established, which is transit fees, sewer fees, school fees, etc., that are very well established, but are something else that obviously the public needs to pay attention to when it's interacting with the private sector through the zoning system. A couple of big things I want to say about zoning. One is the huge opportunity right now that's sort of being tested policy-wise in several different cities on the West Coast is putting a much larger slate of required community benefits on private developers through the zoning system when those developers opt into a zoning sort of schedule that allows increased density. So this is what developers, certainly in desirable urban areas, are always trying to get, is the ability to build a little more, make a little more money if they're going to do the project in the first place, and really just saying as a trade-off, you can build a little higher, you can build a few more units if you agree to X, Y, and Z in terms of community benefits. The most common thing you hear discussed is, of course, upping your affordable housing fees, and I think the governor just floated a law that would make projects that include a certain amount of affordable housing and are infill projects in cities by right projects if they include enough affordable housing. So this is an incredibly complex area. There's a lot of hot topics there, but that basic concept, I think it's important to distinguish the concept of what are the rules for everybody. You know, if you come in and you're building 100 market rate units, do you also have to build X number of affordable units, as opposed to what are the increased rules that you can put on somebody who's being given an exception or an upzoning of some kind. So that's one of the main things that we flag for zoning. And then a few cities are sort of pushing the boundary of adding other kinds of community benefits aside from affordable housing and aside from typical planning issues into the zoning process when an upzoning or an increased density zoning scheme is on offer to developers. So there's been some talk about local hire and local business requirements in those cases. So that's kind of an interesting angle on this as well. I guess I think one of the concepts that cuts across both the project by project negotiations as well as the zoning policies is really just it's the mindset that the public at all these points when it's engaging with the private sector needs to just do its best at every angle to try to capture the most community benefits possible. That it has to look at, be creative in looking at every aspect of the legal leverage that it has, every aspect of the policy leverage that it has, and make sure that it's doing its best to sort of shape private economic activity in a way that's going to broadly benefit the residents of this community and distribute these benefits fairly. A couple points I wanted to make on legal issues, and this flows naturally from zoning. There is, in my mind, a sort of widespread myth about the zoning system, which is that it is not a legitimate venue for discussion of essentially economic issues, social or economic issues, right? There's sort of a bunch of things that we all think of as traditional planning issues, like traffic and setbacks and appearance and things like that. Very well established now that affordable housing is part of that. But you still very frequently hear the notion that living wages, local hiring, the relationship between big box stores and small box stores. Small stores are not sort of legitimate aspects of the planning system. This might sound strange to some of you who have seen some of these. Big box regulations are in a lot of cities now. But I do hear it a lot. When, if you try to, I've had clients who wanted to put local hiring language into specific plans and been told very clearly by planning professionals and by city attorneys that they didn't think that specific plans were appropriate places for issues of economics like local hiring and wage levels and so forth. I think this is not legally accurate. The zoning laws cover all kinds of issues. The zoning law derives from the police power, which is extremely broad and covers regulation of morality and wages and all kinds of things. So I don't think it's accurate. I think it's more like there's resistance to it because it hasn't been done a lot, but it's being done a little more and more as we go. That gets me a little to the role of the city attorneys, and I guess we had a lot of people working for public entities. I spend a lot of my time wrangling with city attorneys, whether I'm representing community groups or even when I'm brought in by a public entity to work alongside a city attorney. I think there's a few different models of city attorneys, but one that I really dislike is the model where the city attorney feels like their job is to veto anything that in their opinion causes legal risk for the city. And that's, maybe that sounds like an overstatement, but that's kind of, the dynamic you can understand, where a policymaker or a staffer would come in and say, hey, we want to explore doing this, and the city attorney would say, you can't do that, it's probably illegal, or there's too much legal risk with that, and that's the end of the discussion. But it's important for all us attorneys to remember that the client is actually in charge, and your job as an attorney is to assess the legal risk, and it's actually your job to help them think of ways to advance their policy goals with a minimum of legal risk. Do the best you can with that, and then the client, in this case the public entity, gets to decide, here's my policy goal, here's the assessment I've heard of how much legal risk there really is, I'm going to decide to go ahead with it or not go ahead with it. So that's an important dynamic to remember with the city attorneys, whether you're advocating from the outside or you're working from the inside. We've talked about these topics that are way too broad for a lot of very specific legal issues, but everything I've mentioned is, has some legal issues involved, and the particulars of them are very dependent on the context. So all I would say is that in almost every one of these situations, there's something that a public entity can do to advance community benefits. They may need to shift exactly who the target group is or exactly the mechanism that they want to use to do it. There are certainly things they can try to do that are illegal, but especially keeping in mind that almost everything an entity does involves some kind of risk assessment. There's almost, in all of these circumstances, there's something that the public entity can do to try to advance equity, whether there's zoning or negotiating a deal or whatever. I had a little more about sort of best practices for community advocates as well, and public engagement processes, but I want to make sure we have enough time for other speakers. Thank you.